Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. Today's video is about a quilt that I've been working on for nearly 2.5 years, aka Paul's quilt. And so, as you might imagine, I have a lot to say about it. So stay with me. So we do these stories about these quilts that I make because I can't do anything easy or simple, I guess. This quilt is no exception. But sometimes when I start talking about the quilt that I make for someone, I reflect on my relationship with them. And more than once, I've gotten a little weepy. Our youngest child used to call whoopy, which I feel like is far more appropriate to be whoopy over something. And I 100% would do that if I actually talked about Paul and what he means to me. But there are so many things that happened to make this quilt come together that instead of giving you this however long video on how much I love Paul and this quilt for him, instead I'm going to tell you about the quilt. It started from a desire to find great quilt patterns for shirts. And if you haven't seen any of those videos, we have a whole playlist on them of patterns that work really, really well for men's shirts. And so I'm always on the prowl for them. And back in October of 2022, I was doing exactly that and talking to my friend Jennifer, and she had a pattern in mind that she thought would be great for shirts. And so I recruited her, and she made a baby quilt out of shirts because, of course, as my friend, she has begun to thrift. And by begun, I mean, she's been doing it along with me for almost this whole time. And so she was going to make a baby quilt out of shirts, which she did do. And then she sent it to me like, this one is a great one for shirts. And I got her quilt and loved it so much. I was like, what if I did a completely different version of this exact same quilt block? And partly because, I have to do it myself. Bless my heart. I just have to do it myself. I hadn't been quilting very long at that point. Well, still haven't actually, but really hadn't at that point, and had not made a quilt with a dark background. And I thought, oh, maybe it'll be fun and interesting if I make a quilt block with a dark background using shirts. Well, actually, I used shirts for all of it, but we'll get there. So that's what I did. And once I got the block together, Paul happened to be walking through the house and passed where I finished the block and took one look at it and went, ooh, I like that. And I was like, I know, right? Me too. And we just kind of like stood there a minute and like, ooh. And it's funny because Paul doesn't typically like a lot of quilts that have a dark background. And so when he was like, ooh, I was like, I'm surprised you like this. You don't really like a dark. He was like, I know. So let me stop and spread it out so you can see it. And then I'll tell you some more. So here's the quilt. So obviously I made another block. And before it had become all this was the very first block. And I liked it so much that I made another one just for the heck of it, and liked it so much that I just committed to a whole quilt. And I think that kind of happens too. Once you're 2 or 3 test blocks, at that point, it's not a test anymore. You're really committed. So if you're wondering what the quilt pattern is, it's Quilty Stars by Emily Dennis of Quilty Love. And we did actually do a great quilt pattern video on it. So if you want to watch that video, we'll give you the link in the description and also a link to the pattern. This is a little bit of a breakout from where I normally am. I don't do a lot of Scrappy. If you've been with me for a while, you know this about me. And usually I'm very controlled in the Scrappy. On the pattern title, it says Quilty Stars, and then a Scrappy pattern or something like that. Scrappy is on the front page of the pattern. And that's part of what makes it so great for shirts. But after I made the first couple of blocks, I may have gotten 3 totally made with that navy shirt before I realized, oh gosh, I'm never going to find enough matching navy shirts to do a whole quilt. At the time, I had not really ordered a lot of fabric as opposed to shirt fabric. Sometimes I double up words when I mean something. Fabric from a bolt of fabric as opposed to fabric from a shirt. And so I caved or maybe compromised and ordered Moda Bella Solid in navy. So had the right name and everything, so that I could do the rest of the quilt. Just the thought of buying a bunch of navy shirts and them not matching in the background was just not acceptable to me at that point. I probably wouldn't mind now, but at the time, that was like, no, I have to have the uniformity. So I ordered Moda Bella Solids in navy and got it in, and I had made, I think, a block. And I have to stop at this point. This is one of those Kathy stories where I have to stop and tell a side story so that you can understand the main story, which is my love affair with Denim and Flower shirts. So my video assistant, aka Paul, had gotten some Denim and Flower shirts. They didn't just magically appear. Thank goodness for editing and Paul. This is a Denim and Flower shirt. And the interesting thing about Denim and Flower shirts, and there always is something interesting about Denim and Flower shirts, is they have almost without fail unique yokes and cuffs and collars. But very often the actual shirt fabric is interesting as well. And so this is one of those cases. Here is the fabric. This is the outside of the shirt. So this is the shirt as a man would wear it. And I want to show you the inside. You might be noticing that the right side of the fabric is inside and the wrong side of the fabric is what is actually out there for people to see. So that alone is interesting. This particular yoke has little dark blue carrots, like the font carrot, not the carrot. And Paul and I had to take a laughing break on that. My bad. And it has this little red something that when I first saw it, I thought it was sailboats. So I thought it was red sailboats on a sea of blue carrots. And instead, I don't know what it is. But this would be a perfect example of why I love Denim and Flower shirts. The shirt is very substantial. It's a good quality weight. It's very soft. They're often 100% cotton. And then they have these really neat details. Let me give you another example. This one is linen and cotton. So you know I bought it. With this in the yoke. Now, that is a very small piece of fabric, you're thinking. And you'd be right. Also, very often, it's pretty easy to get this tag out, and then it leaves this really kind of beautiful print. They're almost always prints, and they're very often interesting both in either print or color. And so it's too nice to throw away, and I don't want to put it in the scrap bin because, as we've established earlier, I'm not really a scrap quilter. And so I had just kind of been putting them to the side, like I will find a use for them. I'm Vanna. I'm revealing the puzzle for the day. So I had all these really interesting yokes and cuffs and collars, and it occurred to me that these half square triangle sections, kind of looks like a flying geese, but it's actually half square triangles, would easily come from a yoke. And once I made that, I don't know if it was realization or decision or revelation, it was like someone had turned the light on. And so I started noticing them in all of the Denim and Flower shirts that I had and started collecting to make more navy blocks. And at that point, Paul and I were calling them the navy blocks. Like I would get all the fabric out, and by fabric, I mean shirt, not fabric, shirt fabric. I would get it all out and spread it out on the floor of the living room to try to put fabrics together that had a similar color palette. And he would go, "Oh, are you making a new navy block?" I'm like, yeah. So what started happening, because that's what I started doing, was I had, the light blue and navy block. And then I ended up with a blue and yellow block. And I had there's a grayish block. And then there's one that's very navy. And every time I would make one, I would get it put together. I'd be like, "Paul, you have to come see this block." And he would dutifully come in because he's incredibly supportive and look at the block and he'd go, "Ooh, I really like that one." And it's interesting because these are far busier fabrics than I normally use, like very, very busy, and prints up against prints. And I don't typically do that. You can actually see right here in this block that I'm holding, there's this print up against this print, up against this print. Actually, all of these are prints. And that's not kind of my way, if I had a way. But I just liked the way they came together. And because it has such a grounding of the background fabric on the outside and this same background fabric square, there's something about the design of this that's especially beautiful. And then it's made to be scrappy, which shows. And I just love making these blocks. And you'll know this if you follow me on Instagram because you probably saw several of them. For a while, I put almost every block that I did. The more I made of them, the more the idea that this is Paul's quilt kind of codified in my mind. And I was just making them as I got to them, as I would find new fabrics with new yokes. And I just kind of was low-key hoarding Denim and Flower shirts and yokes. A couple of the patrons have just sent me Denim and Flower shirts. When they see them, they'll just pick them up and send them to me, which, my goodness, the generosity there is unreal. And I have used them. And some of these are just shirts. But once I really started doing it, I'd make a block here, I'd make a block there, which is why this has been a 2.5-year investment in time and energy and love and happiness. And I got about almost this far. And Paul said something along the lines of "Well, you're almost done, aren't you?" No, I mean, I think I have, 8 more blocks to go or something, a third more. In my mind, I was making a quilt for Paul. And he's not even a big person, which is kind of funny. And he was like, "Oh, well, I'm just probably going to use it where I think I'd like to use it would be in my chair when I'm working on my laptop or when we're watching TV in the evening." And I realized I'm almost done. And so sure enough, I think I had one more block that I put together. And so I ended up with a couple of blue and yellow, couple of gray and white, couple of light blue, couple of navy blue. I have kind of one outlier that's got some funky fabrics in it. All of a sudden it came together. And then all of a sudden I had the sashing done and the whole thing had come together. And even though the navy shirts are not exactly the color of the Moda navy, it's so close that unless you were sitting right here with me, or if you're watching Paul do the B-roll for this video, you probably wouldn't notice. And so it was up on the design wall for a while, and then I had to take it down because I needed the design wall for something else. And it literally got folded up and put in the whip pile, which is sad. And I think it's mostly because I'm not in the moment in a lot of areas of my life. I tend to think ahead, not where am I right now. But a lot of times when I'm quilting, I'm just enjoying making this block and just enjoying choosing fabrics for this block or that block, or how can I put these two blocks together, or which blocks look the best, which configuration of these blocks works the best. So I had given almost no consideration to the backing and zero consideration to the binding. Once I got it together, and initially I had some like, what do you want to do for the backing? And because it's Paul's quilt and because I want it to really be comforting and meaningful for him, I don't want it to be my choices necessarily. I want it to be something, it's a collaboration. I want to do the things and put my little spin on it, but I also, he's the one that's going to be using it. So we talked about what kind of backing to put on it. Here were my options: flannel sheet, flannel thrifted sheet, thrifted flannel sheet, thrifted regular sheet, thrifted linen sheet, or something unknown, or shirts. And we even talked about like, what color would we like? Would we like light blue? Would we? And I say we because it's going to be here in our living room. And so to a certain extent, it wouldn't have bothered me. He could have said red and that would have been okay. But we did kind of just discuss it and settled on like, really, gray would be nice. Just a nice, like, the top is really the star. It just needs to be a nice soft gray. No scratchy linen, no hot flannel, no... Actually, I could have done a sheet, and he was actually fine with a sheet. But then that felt like not interesting enough for someone that I love as much as I love. And so I decided, dang, the whole front is shirts. I really need to be faithful and put shirts on the back. So I decided on gray shirts. That was a long way to tell that story, which is the way I tell every story. Then I had to, twist my arm, go to the thrift store and try to find gray shirts that I liked that would go together. And so I did, in fact, do that. And at some point, just on some random Saturday, I was like, I am figuring out this backing. So let me turn it over and show that to you. So here's the back. And I'll tell you how I did this because I'm hoping this will be helpful for you if you're a shirt user for fabric. What I did, I got all of the shirt backs in the gray shirts that I felt like worked with each other, which maybe I just need to do a whole video about how I think gray is hard to choose because of all the variations of gray. Now, I talk about this all the time: pinky gray and purpley gray, and maybe that's a video. But I picked grays that I felt like worked together and put them in an orientation that I liked. And then I took the shirt backs and I found the size piece that would work for every shirt back. I realized that I love math and this is elementary math, but this was always a big issue for me. And it's the nomenclature. So the lowest common denominator was a size that is remarkably close to the size of a fat quarter. I think it was 17 by 21. It was like so close to a fat quarter. And it's only because one of the shirts was like a medium instead of a large or an extra large. If they had all been large or extra large, it'd have been a fat quarter. And so I laid them out on my living room floor and realized that I was going to have to supplement what I had in order to make it big enough to be able to send it to my friend who does long arming for family and friends, Sissy. First, I added the long navy column, the vertical one. So it was neither wide enough nor long enough. And so I added a ribbon of navy through the top to bottom and from left to right, and was actually pretty pleased with myself. So I was just like, look at me go. And then I realized I had done it again, which is created a backing that needed to be centered and squared. And it was going to the long armor, which is all of you long arm quilters out there. I hope that you're like, oh my goodness, Kathy, not again. And I did. I absolutely did. At that point, I either called or texted Sissy and said, okay, I have the backing ready. I'm wanting to send you Paul's quilt. Are you, willing and able? Yes, she's willing and able. And I was like, and it has a centered backing. And she's like, girl. And I was like, okay, and right now it's exactly the size of the quilt front, the quilt top. What do I need to do to make this where this will work for you? And so what I did is I put a border of the navy because I had so much extra, since the quilt needed to not be as big as I thought it did. I had a lot of extra, which was great. So I put a border all the way around it that was also exactly the same width all the way around, so she could use that as her marker for how to line it up. I am not intentionally just adding to Sissy's skill level. It's totally accidental. There are always challenges with my quilts, and I think that's true. So I have to stop and tell you about the funny relationship that Sissy and Paul have. And this part will be brief, I promise. So Paul does not love dark backgrounds on the quilt top, but he loves a meander or a very busy and intricate quilting pattern in light thread on dark fabric. So specific. He loves it. And I think it's just because he loves the texture and he loves this. He is very interested in the actual quilting part and the skill of the quilting. And that is so appealing to him. And so I want to say the first time we met Sissy, he was like, okay, so I'm going to get Kathy to make me a quilt that has a dark back on it. And I want you to do white quilting on it, white meander quilting on it, basically. She laughed. And so then they started, this has become a thing between the two of them, that they pick and play at each other about it. He's like, Sissy, when are you going to make me that quilt with the white quilting on the dark background? And she goes, Paul, it's hard to get the tension just right. And if you don't, if you have any mistakes, they show. So they just tease each other about it. They're back and forth and back and forth. So when I called her to tell her that Paul's quilt was finally ready and the backing needed to be centered, and the front was dark. And she's like, I'm not doing white quilting. Basically. And I laughed. I was like, okay, you don't have to do light quilting on the front, but you have got to do at some point. I was like, it's got navy on the back. She's like, okay, we'll talk about it. And really, this is so often the case. I feel like the quilting is really the best thing about this quilt. I know I made this quilt, but I feel like the quilting might be the best thing about this quilt. On the front, she did navy quilting in the navy sections and light gray in all of the Quilty Stars. See what I did there? When you see the quilt, you experience the quilting because of the texture and the shadows that it creates, but it doesn't call attention to the quilting. But the quilting is stellar. You really only know if you're very, very close, like right now I am, and I'll tell you about that in a second, or if you turn it over. So before I go back to the back, there are these navy squares, as you've seen, right in the middle of every star. And what she did a quilting sample in each block, which is, to me, just some creative genius. This one is a crosshatch on the diagonal. This one is spirals. This one is like a starburst. So every line starts from this point and goes out. And every star has its own unique center. There's pebble quilting, there's wavy crosshatch, there's wavy that almost looks like fish, there's a vine pattern. There's so many. I can't even name them all. And then she did Paul's favorite meander all through the rest of the navy. So it's just meander through the sashing into all of these sections. It's almost like she used the sashing to get all throughout the quilt. Let me not be remiss in pointing out that what she did for the actual star, she did diagonal lines that mirrored the angle of the triangle. So she outlined that element and then did diagonal. And then in what I think is a real stroke of genius, she did orange peel quilting in this section that borders the navy square. You know, it's hump, 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 and then the orange peel in the opposite. And so what that has done, both visually and texturally, is it creates a little, it's not even so much as a puff, but there's no quilting right in the center of each one of these. I don't know if it's 2 inch, 2.5 inch. I don't remember, but these little squares. So they kind of stick up just a little bit in the center of each one of them. So they call attention to themselves, but very subtly so. And when you flip it over, you really get to see. So there's the navy of the meander, which is, she's an excellent meanderer. The thought of doing meander kind of gives me a cold sweat. And as we were exploring all of the center squares, it's like a game of I Spy in this quilt. And really with Sissy's quilts that she does for me, she'll put little Easter eggs all throughout it. And she has created a catbird quilt, the catbird quilt logo. She'll put that in the quilts that she quilts for me. So we, of course, had to turn it over and find it because it's hard to see it from the front. So here it is. And it's a big catbird quilt this time. Normally it's little in a corner somewhere tucked away. This time it gets its own little feature block. And as we were looking like, oh, look, it's like that one's feathers. And this one is the starburst. And this one is spirals. And all of that. We get to this other block. So it's catbird quilt logo. And then almost like peacock feathers. I don't know which really... It's maybe feathers? I don't know what that's called. And then, oh my goodness, is that a guitar? And so Paul is a guitarist, if you didn't know that already. He was a jazz guitarist in college, and that was his major when I met him, hence the jazz portraits behind me. And we just went, oh my gosh. So the two of us are reflected in this quilt, surrounded by this beautiful quilting sampler that you really only see really if you're the person using it, because that's the person who sees the back. If it's thrown over the chair or over the couch, you see this loveliness, but you really don't get the benefit of the quilting unless you're the user, which I love. So that's kind of how that came to be. And then it got here, and of course we oohed and awed, and it doesn't photograph well because she did it so well. Like, she understood the assignment. She did it so well that, like, if I take a flat front picture, you just can't even see it. We got all the way like, oh, Sissy's so awesome. Of course, Paul had to call Sissy, and they had to tease each other again about the light quilting on the navy background. And I will say this. I think her concern, she never really exactly said this, maybe kind of alluded to it. Like, I mean, the thing about light quilting on a dark background is if you have an oops, or if your thread tension isn't just right, or if you don't make good thread choices, it just shows. It's just so obvious. And so I think she wanted to do, because she really loves Paul and me, and she and her husband, John, have been so great and so welcoming and encouraging to us. I think she thought it was maybe she's going to have mistakes or things show and it not be the quality that she would want to do. And her fears were completely misplaced, totally unwarranted, because she did such beautiful work all throughout the whole quilt. Also, side note, we're not that, I mean, we're pretty discerning, but we love Sissy and we love what she does. And so even if there had been like some horrible mistake, would have been like, oh, that's great. And it would have been 100% fine. Only thing I haven't talked about is the binding. And this was probably the single easiest binding decision I've ever made. It's because there really were no other options in my mind except to do it in navy. For a brief and fleeting moment, I considered maybe a light gray, and then I was immediately like, no, because your eye would immediately be drawn to the binding. What makes this quilt, to me, in part, so beautiful and interesting is this really great dark background with these stars popping out all over it. And of course, we know the backstory of this is a collar, and this is a yoke, and this is a cuff. I mean, these are bits and pieces from a shirt. And I just wanted nothing to detract from that. And so I did the binding in the background fabric. And I think I've said Motabella Solid about 10 times, but that was the navy. And then because it has that navy in the background, in the backing, gosh, the B's in quilting. Background, backing, binding, batting. Oh, I didn't talk about the binding. It really just frames out the back. The navy does. And it just, there's nothing remarkable about it. What's interesting about the backing is the quilting and perhaps my use of shirts. The 10 seconds on batting is I use bamboo batting because it's the softest and the drapiest, and so far the best I've used, and I wanted the best for my husband, who I love. And so, ta-da, here we are. It was such an interesting thing because I've had it now for so long. It was like the best thing ever, getting it finished, and also crazy anticlimactic. I think I had more joy and excitement when I made the very first block, just to be honest. But it has been a delight to see it all come together. And I came out the other morning and Paul was already up and had made coffee and had his quilt thrown over his legs as he was, going through morning email. And it was just the most wonderful and exciting thing. And I'm hoping that, as usual, I think I say this with every quilt, I hope he just uses it to death. I hope we just use it and wash it and use it until it is just in tatters. And then I will know that I have made a really great quilt for the love of my life. So if you're interested in making this quilt pattern, again, we'll include it in the description box. It is really a fun one to make, and it's a fun one if you enjoy putting fabrics together. So I highly encourage that you, even if you just make a block, I think it's fun. But I am grateful to have you along with me today talking about this quilt and what it means to have made it, and all of the people that contributed to it. Jennifer for the idea origination, and then Paul and me and Sissy. And so now we have a quilt to show for it. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.